In this lecture, you are going to learn about the indigenous societies of North America in the 1400s. This lecture will answer the historical questions of how was life in the Americas right before contact with Europeans. What type of societies existed in the Americas right before contact? How were they different from one another? Similar. We will begin by learning about the indigenous groups that lived in North America right before contact. Indigenous groups populated and shaped the world that Europeans encountered. Some experts claim that indigenous groups inhabiting present-day United States and Canada number 18 million to 20 million, while others place the population at no more than a million. A prudent estimate is about 4 million. By the 1490s, indigenous groups lived throughout North America, but compared to England and elsewhere in Europe, they were spread thinly across the land. About 1/3 of Native North Americans lived in the enormous woodland region east of the Mississippi, clustered in 3 broad linguistic and cultural groups. Algonquian, Iroquois, and Muskogean. Algonquian tribes inhabited the Atlantic seaboard, the Great Lakes region, and much of the upper Midwest. Along the Atlantic seaboard, many grew corn and other crops in addition to hunting and fishing, while tribes around the Great Lakes and northern New England rely heavily on hunting, fishing, and gathering wild rice. The Iroquois tribes inhabited Pennsylvania, central New York, and the upland regions of the Carolinas and Georgia. They distinguished themselves from their neighbors by building permanent settlements. Among the Iroquois tribes were the Iroquois. The Iroquois were a confederation of Iroquois tribes, also known as the League of 5 Nations. The 5 nations inhabited key lands northeastern of what is now the United States and southeastern Canada. The Confederation was founded to bring peace at a time of great turmoil. By the time Europeans arrived, the Confederacy was well established, giving the Iroquois both a united front and considerable political power. The Great Plains peoples accounted for 1/7 of the total native North American population. Many of the Plains people were pushed into the plains by stronger tribes. For example, in what is now Canada, the Blackfoot Confederacy will wage war reckons the Plains Cree to the north and the Sioux and Crow to the south. Some Plain Indians farm, while others depended on the buffalo, also known as the American bison, for their subsistence. About 1/5 of all native North Americans resided along the Pacific coast. The abundant natural food supply held back the development of agriculture while sustaining large populations. It is estimated that half of what is now Canada's native population was living in British Columbia at the time of contact. The rich culture supported a hierarchical social structure. However, it is interesting to note that true wealth did not lie on the amount one was able to hoard, but rather on the amount one is able to give. For many of these cultures, lavish gift-giving raised one's status. It was not uncommon to see various rituals in which the elite will give away gifts to establish their status and create alliances. Roughly 1/4 of native North Americans live in settled agricultural communities in the Southwest. Like their ancestors, they continue to grow corn, beans, and squash using methods they had refined for centuries. The Inuit adapted to life in the Arctic desert, and they were almost wholly dependent on fish and animal life. Central to the Inuit life was the caribou. Moving seasonally from one camp to the other, the Inuit will gather in groups of up to 100 in winter. However, unlike other groups in the Americas, Inuit contact with the outside world was brief well into the 20th century. The current population of Canada's Inuit is around 40,000, and many of them still hunt regularly. Although these indigenous groups had different distinct cultures, languages, and economies, they also share many similarities. For example, although many native North Americans in the 1490s practiced agriculture, many still depended on hunting and gathering for a major portion of their food. Native North Americans did not use wheels. Sailing ships were unknown to them. They had no large domesticated animals such as horses, cows, or oxen. Their only metal was copper. None employ writing, expressing themselves instead in many other ways, like drawings were sketched on stones, wood, and animal skins. Patterns were woven in baskets and textiles, designs were painted on pottery, created into beadwork, or carved into effigies, and songs, dances, religious ceremonies, and burial rites were created. Origin stories are also something many of these groups had in common. Sometimes groups will have multiple origin stories that will tell differing versions of creation and the founding of the group. Origin stories often begin with a first person or first peoples, a mythical man or woman who founded the group. These first people often are created from or emerge from the natural world itself. Animals often played an important role in these stories as well. These origin stories encapsulated and shaped the worldview of each group, establishing their people's purpose in this world as well as their relationship to the spirits and the world around them. In other words, origin stories are key to establishing a group identity and a deep connection with the region the people inhabit. The Cherokee creation story reads as follows. When all was water, the animals were above in Galuanti beyond the arch, but it was very much crowded, and they were wanting more room. They wondered what was below the water, and at last the unique beaver's grandchild, the little water beetle, offered to go and see if he could learn. It darted in every direction over the surface of the water, but could find no firm place to rest. Then it divided to the bottom and came up with some soft mud, which began to grow and spread on every side until it became the island which we call the earth. It was afterward fastened to the sky with 4 cords, but no one remembers who did this. Men came after the animals and plants. At first, they were only a brother and a sister, until he struck her with the fish and told her to multiply. And so it was. In 7 days, a child was born to her, and thereafter, every 7 days another, and they increased very fast until there was danger that the world could not keep them. Then it was made that a woman should have only 1 child in a year, and it has been so ever since. Another similarity is that for most indigenous groups, life was not all harmony and bliss. Archaeological sites provide ample evidence of violent conflict among native North Americans. Finally, indigenous groups adapted to the natural environment, but also alter it by building permanent structures, developing agricultural techniques, and setting fires to encourage the growth of certain plants that attracted deer and other game animals. When it pertained to gender relations, many Native American societies were matrilineal. That is, that there were clans and kinship groups in which children became members of the mother's family, not the father's. Tribal leaders were almost always men, but women play an important role in certain religious ceremonies, and female elders often helped select male village leaders and took part in tribal meetings. Women owned dwellings and tools. Because men were frequently away on the hunt, women took responsibility not only of the household duties, but for most agricultural work as well. Husbands demonstrated their masculinity by success in hunting or catching fish. Moreover, numerous land systems existed among Native Americans. Generally, village leaders assigned plots of land to individual families to use for a season or more, and tribes claimed specific areas for hunting. Unclaimed land remained free for anyone to use. Families owned the right to use land, but they did not own the land itself. Few, if any, Native Americans had a fenced-off piece of land belonging forever to a single individual or family. They did not think themselves as a single unified people. This was an idea invented by Europeans. Instead, their identity centered on the immediate social group, a tribe, village, chiefdom, or confederacy. As you can see, these ideas about identity, land use, religion, and gender relations that were part of the culture of many of these indigenous groups in North America will be different from the European notions of identity, land use, religion, and gender. Once Europeans arrive to the Americas, they will see these differences as weaknesses rather than strengths, and often justify their conquest and treatment of these indigenous groups based on these differences. For example, the Eurocentric idea that indigenous groups were not using the land because they did not have fences and individual land titles meant that the land belonged to no one, and thus Europeans had the right to take it. Or the notion that indigenous groups did not have a religion, or that their religious beliefs were backwards, and that is why they needed to be converted to Christianity, will also be an argument put forward by Europeans. But this Eurocentric point of view could not be further from the truth. North American peoples had complex societies. Many of the traditions and cultures had been part of their way of life for thousands of years, and many of those traditions continue to be a part of their culture today. We will continue to discuss about the different North American indigenous groups and their interactions with Europeans as we move along. That is all for now. Please stay tuned for the next video lecture.